Welcome everyone, bienvenidos. This is Gestures of Language, a conversation on art and translation. I'm Angelica Lopez-Torres. I'm the International Rights Manager at the University of Texas Press, and I have the absolute pleasure to be joined today by Gloria Susana Esquivel. She's the author of Animales at the End of the World, which we'll be discussing today. I'm gonna try to put that up here for a second. And also Robin Myers, who translated the novel from the original Spanish to English. Gloria teaches in the creative writing program at the Instituto Carro y Cuervo in Bogota and has published various works of poetry. Animales at the End of the World, I was about to do Spanglish version of the title, is her first novel. And Gloria is also the host of Colombia's most renowned feminist podcast, Womansplaining. And Robin Myers is a Mexico City-based translator and poet. And in addition to Animals at the End of the World, she's translated Lyric Poetry is Dead by Ezequiel Seidberg, Cars and Fire by Monica Ramon Rios, and The Restless Dead by Cristina Riva Garza. She was among the winners of the 2019 Poems in Translation contest. This is Words Without Borders, the Academy of American Poets, and writes a monthly column of translation for Palette Poetry. So Animals at the End of the World is one of the translation published in the Latin American Literature and Translation series at the University of Texas Press. It focuses on contemporary Latin American literary fiction. And the ambition of the series is to explore the realities of life in North, Central, and South America through novels and literary work. So we present the world in the English language, some of the finest literary talent from our Latin American neighbors. Gloria's novel is set in the capital of Colombia, Bogota, in the 1980s, and it follows our 6-year-old protagonist, Inés. The story is narrated by Inés when she is an adult, and we follow Inés, whose imagination has led her to believe that the end of the world is upon her and her family after she hears a massive explosion. Inés processes the world around her, these physical and emotional barriers around her, by imagining a wild jungle of animals. And as a child, she's testing the personal and imposed boundaries. It's a coming-of-age story full of heart-wrenching moments. As a kid, really confronts the realities of the world. Today's conversation will be bilingual. There will be some Spanglish as we chat through the process of translation. Gloria will be speaking in Spanish, and Robin and I will try to translate as we go along. We'll start with a reading from Gloria and Robin, a beautiful passage as Inés is sounding out her vowels. Gloria will read the Spanish and Robin will read the translation, and then we'll jump into some questions I've prepared for them, and we'll start the discussion there. And about at the 45-minute mark, I'll start opening the floor to questions from anybody in the audience. All right, Gloria.
Hi, hello everyone. Hola a todos. Estoy muy feliz de estar acá. For the first time I'm meeting Robin and Angelica, and I am like thrilled because I feel like they are my close friends, and their work hizo que este libro existiera. Entonces, muchísimas gracias y gracias a todos por venir. Y voy a empezar a leer y luego Robin leerá el mismo fragmento en inglés. En la noche nos quedamos sentados un largo rato dentro del carro, justo en la entrada de la casa de los abuelos, y antes de que él orquestara la coreografía de mi entrega con Julia o la abuela para evitar encontrarse con mamá, me dijo que tenía otra sorpresa para mí. Sacó una vieja cartilla para aprender a leer y me la entregó. La abrí con cuidado, con temor a que se deshiciera entre mis manos, y él comenzó a señalarme cuáles eran las vocales. La A fue a comprarle un regalo a su mamá. La E se fue con su tía Marta a tomar té. La I fue a comprar un puntico para mí. La O fue a comer tamales y engordó. La U salió en bicicleta y llegó a Perú. Luego me indicó cómo sonaban algunas letras y cómo se veía escrito y codificado el sonido que hacían unas al lado de las otras. La primera página de la cartilla mostraba a un niño junto con su madre leyendo un libro semejante al que yo tenía en mis manos. La madre lo miraba con cariño, el niño tenía los labios entreabiertos. La descripción de la lámina era, mi mamá me mima. La repetí como un mantra hasta memorizar los sonidos combinados de la M y las vocales. La página siguiente mostraba al mismo niño con un hombre bigotudo que lo abrazaba por atrás. Mi papá me ama, le dije a mi padre con fluidez, enseñándole que ya me había iniciado en la lógica combinatoria de los sonidos. Ahora entendía de resonancias. Ese día, él me había sumergido dentro del silencio que se escondía debajo de la superficie del agua, y ahora yo le mostraba sin miedo que era capaz de escuchar el ruido que vivía dentro del alfabeto. Mi padre me felicitó con un beso húmedo y yo me aferré con fuerza a su cuello. Quise explicarle todo lo que había estado pasando detrás de esas puertas desde siempre. Mi madre y su ausencia, la abuela y su distancia, María y su traición, la bestia, sus aullidos y la manera en la que perdía la paciencia conmigo y me cimbraba los huesos cada vez que me acercaba a su armario prohibido. Cuando me pidió que bajara del carro, lo miré a los ojos y me armé de valor para describirle todas esas casas que imaginaba junto a él. Mi deseo más profundo era que nos fuéramos lejos a un desierto en donde cabalgaríamos camellos salvajes y nos alimentaríamos con arroz y huevo, y donde yo no tendría que volver a preocuparme por la rabia de mi abuelo o la tristeza que sentía sobre la lengua cada vez que pensaba en María. Pero las palabras no salieron como lo esperaba. No quiero estar más en esta casa, le confesé, quiero estar contigo. Sentí por un momento que mi cuerpo se hacía mucho más ligero. Se quedó mirándome con sorpresa, tomó mi rostro con sus manos de tortuga y me llenó de besos los ojos. Me agarré de su cuello y le dije lo mucho que lo quería. Él me miró con ternura y acercó sus labios a mi oído. Te prometo que voy a hablar con tu mamá de todo esto. A mí también me gustaría que estuviéramos más cerca. Nos despedimos con un apretón de manos, como si estuviéramos concretando un negocio importantísimo, y entré a la casa sintiendo que mi corazón tenía el tamaño de un globo aerostático. Subí las escaleras intentando recordar las formas de las vocales. La A, un grano de sal marina; la E, un gato tomando una siesta; la I, el poste de la luz; la O, un caracol sin cabeza; la U, la lengua azul y gruesa de una vaca; la A, una gota de vinagre; la E, una escalera resbalosa; la I, un tajo que sangra; la O, los labios de mi madre; la U, el idioma que hablan las ambulancias fuera de la casa.
Gracias, Gloria.
Gracias, Gloria. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it is pretty incredible to me, too, that this is the first time that Gloria and I have met in real time. It's such a joy. And I will just jump right into reading the same passage in the English translation that Gloria has just read in Spanish. That night, we sat for a long time in the car right outside my grandparents' house, and before he choreographed my handover to Julia or my grandmother to avoid Mom, he said he had another surprise for me. He took out an old book. This is how I'd learned to read, he said. I opened it cautiously, afraid it might disintegrate in my hands, and he started to show me the vowels. A walked with his Aunt Martha to the park. E went to buy a present for me. I took a shower and started to sing. O saw the animals at the zoo. U rode her bike all the way to Peru. Then he showed me how certain letters sounded and how they were written and spelled out alongside the others. The first page illustrated a corpulent feline perched on a little rug, front paws tucked under him, smirking gently. The caption read, "The fat cat sat on the mat." I repeated it like a mantra until I'd memorized the flat sound of the A with its respective consonants. The next page showed a tall, mustached man dressed in white and crowned with a tall white hat. He towered over various pots and pans as they steamed on a stovetop, studying an open volume and stirring with a wooden spoon. The cook took a look at the book, I told my father fluently, proving that he'd initiated me into the combinatorial logic of sound. Now I knew about echoes. That day, he'd submerged me into the silence of the underwater world, and now, unafraid, I showed him I was capable of perceiving the sounds that lived inside the alphabet. My father praised me with a damp kiss, and I threw my arms around his neck. I wanted to tell him everything that had been happening behind the front doors of my grandparents' house. I wanted to start from the beginning. My mother and her absence, my grandmother and her distance, Maria and her betrayal, the beast. Its howling, its temper, how it rattled my bones whenever I got anywhere near its forbidden closet. When he said it was time to get out of the car, I looked him in the eye and gathered my nerve to tell him about all the houses I'd imagined living in with him. My most fervent wish was for the two of us to go away, far away, to a desert where we'd ride wild camels and live on rice and eggs, and where I'd never have to worry about my grandmother's fury or the sorrow I felt on the tip of my tongue every time I thought about Maria. But the words didn't come out as I'd hoped. I don't want to live in this house anymore, I confessed. I want to be with you. I felt for an instant that my body had gone utterly light. He stared at me. He looked surprised. He took my face into his tortoiseshell hands and planted kisses on my eyelids. I pressed myself into his neck and told him how much I loved him. He looked at me gently and drew his lips close to my ear. I promise I'll talk with your mom about all of this. I'd like us to spend more time together too. We said goodbye with a handshake, as if we were finalizing an important business deal, and as I walked into the house, my heart felt as big as a hot air balloon. I climbed the stairs, trying to remember the shape of the vowels. A grain of salt. E, a cat taking a nap. I, a street lamp. O, a headless snail. U, a cow's thick blue tongue. A drop of vinegar. E, a slippery staircase. I, a bleeding cut. O, my mother's lips. U, the language of the ambulances outside my house.
Thank you both. That's such a beautiful and incredibly vivid passage. And I think it's a perfect segue to ask about the gestures of language in the novel. Gloria, you used this phrase to describe Robin's translation in an interview, but both of you had to do some form of translating. Gloria, you translated the voice of a 7-year-old Inés through the adult narrator version of Inés. You created these beautiful metaphors in the language that brings to life this world that Inés as a child presents us. And then Robin, you then have to translate this world into English, as demonstrated by your reading right now. Can both of you talk about this process of bringing Inés's vivid mind to life?
Sí, bueno, primero pasó algo muy mágico, diría yo, porque cuando yo vivía en Nueva York, por casualidades del destino, conocí la obra de Robin y leí Amalgama y fue muy fuerte porque sentí que era una poeta que hablaba de mi experiencia viviendo en esa grandísima ciudad. Y
Gloria,
cuando me
si te
dijeron
puedo
que...
interrumpir para traducir.
Sí.
We'll be getting a rhythm going, but Gloria starts by saying that she liked to begin by talking about something that happened to her when she was living in New York, which is that this is going to be embarrassing for me to interpret, but that she came across a book of my poetry, and she felt as if it was describing something that she had experienced.
Y luego, cuando me dijeron que Robin iba a ser mi traductora, no lo pude creer, porque era una poeta que iba a traducir este libro que también lo escribía yo, que venía de la poesía.
And then when she found out that I was going to be the translator of this book, I'm so embarrassed. She couldn't believe it because, I'm embarrassed enough that I can't even finish that. But that she was coming from the world of poetry, and so it was a coincidence that we'd found each other in this way.
Robin's being modest, but yes, I'm like, I should have translated this part.
I'll be better about the interpreting after we get through.
Yes, but Gloria is just expressing how lucky she felt to have been
Sí.
To find out.
It was serendipity, as
Yes.
they call it. Y luego, cuando yo estaba escribiendo el libro, para mí era muy importante eso, como traducir las sensaciones de mi infancia. Para mí, un gran referente, tuve 2 referentes muy grandes y muy extraños, Tom y Jerry y The Shining.
As I was starting to write this book, that was very important to me, that I was able to translate the sensations of my childhood into this book. And there were 2 crucial references as I wrote. One was Tom and Jerry, and the other was The Shining.
para mí fue una revelación de adulta que cada vez que mostraban a los dueños de Tom y Jerry, que solo los mostraban de la cintura para arriba, entendí que era porque así los veían ellos, ¿no? O sea, que todo Tom y Jerry estaba hecho desde la perspectiva del gato y del ratón.
It was an adult revelation to realize that whenever the owners of Tom and Jerry are depicted on screen, they're shown from the waist up, and I realized that that was because they were being perceived from the perspective of Tom and Jerry themselves.
Y para mí, bueno, yo comencé a escribir este libro en Nueva York, pero luego lo terminé en Bogotá. Y cuando volví a Bogotá, volví a muchos espacios de mi infancia y todos esos espacios estaban dislocados, como que yo los recordaba de una manera muy diferente a como eran en realidad o como mis ojos de adulta los veían ahora.
I started writing the book in New York and finished it in Bogota. And when I returned to Bogota, I also revisited many spaces from my childhood. And I was struck to realize that I had remembered them in a completely different way, or I was perceiving them now with an adult gaze that transformed them.
Entonces sentí que ahí podía crear poesía, ¿no? Que ahí podía como nacer el lenguaje, como que ahí podía estar esa voz que aparece en este libro, ¿no? Como volver a ese lugar de la infancia en donde meterse debajo de la cama era meterse en una cueva infinita.
That was how I realized that I could make poetry, that something could happen, and then I could return to that childhood space in which when you go under the bed, you're going into a cave.
Entonces, cuando escribía era muy extraño y la gente me miraba muy raro porque intentaba como navegar el espacio de mi casa como si fuera Inés, ¿no? Entonces me metía bajo el escritorio y intentaba como tener esa perspectiva de tamaño muy similar a lo que pasa en The Shining, ¿no? En esa escena icónica de el niño en el triciclo, que ese pasillo se ve inmenso, inmenso, inmenso. Entonces, eso era lo que yo quería hacer.
As I started writing the book, it was a strange process, and people thought that I was crazy because I was trying to inhabit and travel around my own house as a child, and to get in the different spaces of the house, like in that iconic scene in The Shining when the child on the tricycle is riding down the passage of the hallways, and they seem absolutely enormous. I was trying to relive that.
Y creo que eso es como, esa es la atmósfera del libro, ¿no? O sea, yo quería, porque otra influencia muy grande para mí, vital y literaria, pero sobre todo vital, es Anais Nin. Y la literatura de ella está plagada de atmósferas. Es sobre todo como una gran atmósfera por la que ella nos lleva. Entonces yo dije, ok, quiero hacer esa atmósfera de infancia.
This is sort of the atmosphere of the book, and in that sense, another important reference for this novel is the work of Anais Nin, which is sort of a study of atmospheres. And so I decided that this novel for me would be the atmosphere of childhood.
Yeah.
Those are such great just shows to reference as you think about the world that you created. Sorry, Robin, I know you're.
No, I was thrilled by that too. And yeah, I mean, I think in perceiving what Gloria had, that atmosphere, and thinking about sort of what my job was as a translator, what I started to think about a lot is the nature of this voice. It's a novel that I sort of started to think about it as if I was looking through a window and seeing what Inés sees, but I was looking at the window through a curtain, and the curtain is the voice of the adult Inés. And so I had to figure out how, this isn't making it up out of nowhere. Gloria has already done the work of creating that effect. And yet I had to find a way to respect that, to respect both the image in that childhood sense, the kid on the tricycle going down, and to make both of those things, both the filter through the adult voice and the immediacy of the child voice, sound somehow as natural as she managed to do in Spanish. In preparation for this talk today, I was thinking about this, a line from a translator friend of mine, Sophie Hughes, and I wanted to read it just because I think it just completely summarizes what translation is for me and the experience of translating Gloria's book. She says, I approach a text that is already complete, mature, sure of itself, and it's my responsibility to look after it, to respect it for what it is, its nature, essence, while protecting it from linguistic butchery, from translationese, from too many mistakes or outlandish mis- and reinterpretations. So I think in there's this deceptive language that we use when we talk about both writing and translation, which is that it sounds, if something sounds natural, if something sounds easy, and how to do justice to the ease while doing all of the things that are not easy that you have to do in order to get there. I think also, Gloria mentioned that we both come from the sort of poetry world. And that was very important to me too in translating Animals at the End of the World. I think a lot as I translate about tension, about sort of how sentences move. I really appreciated her use of the word gestures there, because I do think of it as an almost physical movement, as if a given sentence is remarking on the sentence that came before it, or if it's declaring itself, or if it's cutting itself short. These sorts of really quite material acts that sentences do, which I think poetry is all about, is that kind of distillation. And I think, this is obviously a novel, and at the same time it's full of poetry in the sense of the richness and variety of her sentence structure, of the imagery, and so I think that that was the sort of great challenge and gift to me as the book's translator, was to sort of receive this really rich, active, sort of muscular. I sometimes hate it when people use the muscular prose, but what I mean is that it's moving. The muscles are moving, and you can see them. And I thought a lot about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got to say, I think both you, Gloria, and Robin really respected and protected Inés's story and her voice throughout. Well, let me jump here to the next question. The idea of the end of the world is present throughout the novel. Inés's world seems to end and begin anew several times, from chapter to chapter sometimes as well. And everyone in the novel is quite literally looking forward to Inés's birthday party, a literal coming of a new age. Can you both elaborate on the choices you had to make to create these transitions?
Sí, para mí, bueno, hay una anécdota que fue como desde donde empezó la idea de la novela, como ese chispazo, y fue que estábamos en el año 2012 cuando los mayas dijeron que se iba a acabar el mundo.
There's a story that, for me, the sort of the trigger that launched the idea for this entire novel, and it was in the year 2012, which was when the Mayan calendar had predicted the end of the world.
Y yo vivía en Bogotá y estaba trabajando en una revista cultural, y llegábamos los periodistas siempre muy tarde a trabajar, llegábamos como a las 10, 11 de la mañana, y una mañana detonó un petardo en Bogotá. En Bogotá hay una gran historia de atentados terroristas, sobre todo pues en los años 80, y en el año 2012 era un poco extraño que hubiera pasado este atentado.
At the time, I was living in Bogotá and working as a journalist at a cultural magazine, and the journalists, we would show up at work fairly late, sort of 10 or 11 in the morning, and one day, un petardo es como, no es una bomba, pero es como que de sonido nomás, ¿no?
Es como más pequeño, no es un firecracker porque hace daños, pero no es como algo muy masivo. O sea, los daños son más físicos, como de las ventanas, pero no hubo muertos.
Masivo, sí. There was a small explosion, so there were no deaths, but it was the sort of explosive device that goes off that shatters windows and causes structural damage. So one of those went off one morning, and it was very strange that sort of thing would happen.
Y pasó muy temprano, como a las 6 de la mañana, y un amigo periodista vivía justo al lado de donde detonó. Entonces, cuando él llegó a trabajar a las 11, pues todos en la redacción fuimos como, no, ¿qué pasa? ¿Estás bien? Como algo, o sea, como, sí, como, ¿qué necesitas?
This explosion happened very in the morning, like around 6 or 7, and a friend and colleague at the magazine lived right next door to where it happened. And so when everybody showed up around 10 and 11, everybody was terrified. Are you okay? What happened? Do you need anything?
Y lo que él dijo fue, la verdad, me asusté porque fue muy temprano, me despertó y pensé que los mayas tenían razón y que era el fin del mundo.
And he said, truth be told, I was frightened because it was so early, but my first thought was the Mayas were right. It's the end of the world.
Y para mí esa anécdota fue como, esto es vivir en Bogotá. Como, esto es como normalizar una violencia muy fuerte, no tener ningún tipo de espacio público para disfrutar la ciudad, estar siempre como a la expectativa de la muerte y luego como reírnos de eso y como decir, bueno, hoy no fue, sigamos, siguiente día, siguiente atentado.
For me, it completely encapsulated the sense was this is what living in Bogota is like. It means living in constant expectation of disaster and death, of not having sort of public space to enjoy without worry of something like that happening, and then being able to laugh about it and having life go on and have the next day just be completely normal.
Y eso me llevó a mi infancia creciendo en Bogotá en los años 80 y me llevó también a cuando vivía en Nueva York y trabajaba como niñera y ver las diferencias de las infancias pues de una niña en Bogotá que siempre que prendía la televisión veía a Pablo Escobar, veía historias de bombas, historias de muerte, versus ser niñera de estos chicos en Nueva York, donde había palabras que yo no les podía decir, porque eran como trigger warnings y eran como niños que estaban completamente aislados de la muerte y de la tragedia.
That was the environment that I grew up in as a child in the 80s. And then when I went to New York and was working as a babysitter to kids who were growing up in New York, I was stunned by the difference in what reality was like in my childhood and their childhood. And so the experience of realizing that there were things I'd never been exposed to, there are words I couldn't say to them because of the sort of trigger warning environment, that it was just a completely other reality.
Entonces, como que encontré esa metáfora perfecta, ¿no? Como aquí todos los días se acaba el mundo, pero también hay otras urgencias de sobrevivir, y eso era lo que yo quería como mostrar en esta novela, ¿no? Como esta niña crecía en un ambiente muy violento, tanto afuera como adentro de su casa, y cómo ella se aferraba de su imaginación y se aferraba del lenguaje y se aferraba de los pocos recursos que tenía para intentar como darle sentido a una violencia muy normalizada.
So this was the sort of perfect metaphor that I found for this book, is that the world ends constantly every day, and yet there's also a different urgency to live. And so what I found in Inés, who's a child who's growing up both in an environment of external violence in her outside world and also domestic violence in her home, is how that violence was there, and yet she clung to her imagination, she clings to language, she clings to play as ways to sort of find that life amid normalized violence.
Y luego, cuando me dijeron que el libro iba a ser traducido al inglés, apareció como esta pregunta que tengo yo sobre un tipo de literatura colombiana que se exporta, que es una literatura en donde tenemos que mostrar los horrores de nuestra violencia y donde hay que mostrar como todo el tiempo, como una especie de realismo mágico meets gore.
When I learned that the novel would be translated into English, I wondered about something related to a certain kind of Colombian literature, a narrative that is exported about Colombia, and perfectly described by Gloria as realism, magical realism meets gore, and the expectation, the taste for that sort of literature.
Y yo no quería eso, y como que fue para mí muy claro como decir, como no quiero que esto se vuelva como esta historia de la pobre niña que crece en este lugar, sino que quería que la voz de Inés fuera traducida como está, ¿no? Y que es una voz también muy universal frente a la infancia, más que frente a la violencia.
I was very clear that I didn't want that. It wasn't going to be this kind of book, and I didn't want it to be the sort of, oh, poor Inés, she's growing up amid all of these horrors, but to have a sort of universal child's voice and experience in the face of that.
Y eso, o sea, no quería tampoco como que quedaran términos en Spanglish ni nada de eso, ¿no? Como que ese tampoco era mi relato. Yo no soy quien tampoco para hablar como una cultura hispanoamericana que utiliza el Spanglish, ¿no? O sea, esa es otra cultura, otro relato de otros inmigrantes que se fueron que no es la mía. Entonces, para mí era muy importante también como enfatizar eso, como esta no es ese tipo de historia.
I also didn't want it to be a sort of narrative where it was full of terms in Spanglish. Like that would have meant a different kind of migrant, of my experience of immigration, of reception in the United States. That wasn't my story. I wanted to be true to the type of story I was telling.
Yeah.
Gracias.
I think.
Ya sé, también a mí, y también lo que iba a decir es que lo que me encanta de Inés, what I love about Inés is that she makes it her story. It's her stubbornness. She digs her heels, and this is her world, and you are invited to it.
It's an incredibly confident, absorbing narrative. And I think, you know, in thinking about your question, Angelica, about the sort of the many different kinds of ends of worlds, it made me think a lot about childhood in general as sort of full of these losses and transformations. And I think Inés as a character, you know, she experiences so many different kinds of fracture and separation from her own parents, from her really only friend. And things that just completely sort of in sometimes massive ways, but sometimes very subtle micro ways, transform her perception of the entire world and what's possible for her inside it. And which I just think Gloria pulls off with just such subtlety, but also such clarity. You know, and I think it's not a novel that tiptoes. And on the level of language, which is sort of my level in translating this book. And I think also just sort of referring back to something about poetry and the kind of weight of language in poetry. I started to sort of pay attention, especially to how Gloria ends her chapters. And often I think as a translator, I think a lot about sort of how to protect ambiguity that's there, you know, in an original text, of how something that isn't sort of spelled out for you can remain not spelled out for you in English, in a way that is powerful and effective. But I think in an equal sense, there's an incredible sort of power in some of these endings, you know, and I think of sort of the chapter endings often as sites of transition, where there is a sort of a description of an event and a reaction to it, and a kind of permission that that Inés via Gloria gives herself to sort of to declare herself as a fully developed subject. And so I think there's one that I just love to read. It's very brief, but just as an example of the kind of unfolding that happens in these transitions. It's at the end, I think, of the second chapter, and the scene is Inés being sort of terrified, intimidated by her grandfather, the beast. No matter what sort of state he was in, these moments with my grandfather always left me flooded with a feeling of uncertainty that became a tepid stream of pee I'd allowed to escape over my shoes and relieve my fear. The warm drops would soak through my underpants before they fled and trickled down my legs. It was a yellow pain, exquisite, new paragraph, deep. And I mean, that's just the kind of the movement of that, and the sort of the ability to convey the intensity of this. And I can remember a moment of that in my own childhood, of sort of like, oh, I'm going to do something embarrassing, but you have to. It's the only way out, you know? And you have to sort of feel that relief, and also this sort of weird sense of agency, which is the only kind you have as a child, to sort of react to the adults around you. So I think, you know, that's not a scene of an end of a world, but it's a scene of it's an accounting inside a world, where there's a lot of browbeating, a lot of reaction, and a lot of limitation in how Inés is able to respond. And so while translating the novel, I tried to pay close attention to those moments where the kind of these twin feelings, these totally inextricable feelings of terror and relief or even pride are allowed to really shine forth.
Yeah. No, those are perfect examples, and that was one of my favorite passages when that happens, and you're just realizing like that was an escape. That was her way to get away. Well, I'm going to jump into the next question. Gloria, you have such fascinating descriptions of these wild animals, the adults surrounding Inés, and you do such a great job at exploring these animalistic behaviors through Inés's as a child's perspective. There are very specific animal characteristics that you attributed, like the beast that we just heard, for the grandfather, the wolf for the outside world, the water metaphors for the father. How did you come to interpret or choose these animals and their behaviors for the adults? And then, Robin, was that hard to keep in line when you were translating it in English?
Bueno, creo que ese uso de los animales tiene mucho que ver con mi background de poesía, porque digamos que lo que yo quería ahí era aplicar ese pensamiento metafórico que se activa cuando uno está escribiendo poesía.
The use of these animal descriptions has a lot to do with my background in poetry as a way to establish these metaphors between humans and animals.
Como me interesaba mucho como esta idea de que es una adulta que recuerda y que la memoria pues es algo que es completamente elusivo, pero así también funciona la poesía, ¿no? Todo el tiempo estamos intentando nombrar algo que se parece a algo, que se parece a algo, que se parece a algo.
It also has to do with the fact of an adult trying to connect with these childhood memories, and which is always elusive, memory itself being elusive. And that's also something that we're trying to do in poetry all the time, is to name something that is like something else, that is like something else, that's like something else.
Y otra cosa que me pasa a mí es que odio, odio mucho cuando en las portadas de los libros ponen como la foto de quien creen que es el personaje, ¿no? Como me pasó con Un crimen y castigo que yo tenía cuando chica, que tenía como la foto de un chico guapo, rubio, y era Raskolnikov.
Also, there's something I hate, which is on the covers of books when they put a photo of who they imagine a character to be. There was a copy of Crime and Punishment that I had as a child where there was a photo of this good-looking, blonde man who they said that was supposed to be Raskolnikov.
Entonces yo quería como que los personajes aparecieran en la mente del lector de esa manera elusiva. Y una manera que yo tengo en mi vida personal de hablar de la gente es casi siempre como buscándoles un parecido, ¿no? Como se parece a, o como que recuerdo mucho los nombres también pensando en esos parecidos.
I wanted the readers to be able to imagine the characters in the book in that same elusive way. And there's also something that I do in my own life, which is that I'm always, when I think of someone or talk about someone, I'm always trying to think of who they remind me of, and it's something, you know, associated with their name.
Entonces, los animales fueron apareciendo así, ¿no? Como cada personaje pertenecía como una especie de reino animal, y digamos tienen ciertos rasgos que automáticamente me hacían pensar en más animales y en más parecidos, ¿no? Entonces el padre que tiene como las manos manchadas, que eso es de mi padre, de hecho, y, sí, y son iguales al caparazón de una tortuga, ¿no? O alguna vez escuché a alguien describir a Clarice Lispector como con pómulos de gato, y yo dije, ok, esa es la madre, ¿no?
The names and animal qualities of the characters sort of began to appear this way, in this associative sense. For instance, the father in the book has sort of spotted hands like a tortoise shell, and that comes from my own father. And so that was the dad. I once read a description of the Brazilian author Clarice Lispector saying that she had cat-like cheekbones, and so I thought that's the mom.
Y así como que sentía también que En el caos en el que vive Inés, como lo único que ella tiene es nombrar, y luego hay algo, para mí, el momento más violento de la novela es el momento en el que Inés reduce a María a una sola palabra.
I also thought that within the novel, the only power that Inés really has is to name, is to come up with these ways of naming things around her. And for me, the most violent moment in the novel is when Inés reduces María, her friend, to a single word.
Y es como algo que siento que pasa mucho en Colombia, bueno, en el mundo, digamos ahora con Donald Trump, white supremacy, etcétera, pasa, ¿no? Y es como reducir al otro a una sola palabra, ¿no? Es muy violento y es algo que fragmenta mucho la relación con el otro. Entonces quería ese contraste entre este devenir animal, este flujo de animales el mundo cambia, y luego cuando Inés pierde la inocencia, María es solo una sirvienta y nada más.
Something that happens a lot in Colombia and really in the entire world. I mean, we can think of Donald Trump and white supremacy and all of these cases of racism and xenophobia in which any other is reduced to a single word, and it completely transforms and stifles the relationship with the other. And so there's something about this I wanted to contrast this fluid part of the novel, this sort of constant becoming, in which different characters have different sort of animal selves and they come and go, to this rigid sort of reduction of to use the key example of Inés and María. María is reduced to the servant.
Yeah.
Gracias, Gloria.
Sí, gracias.
I love the part of and the sort of the poetic fluidity of the different names and how they're allowed to kind of come and go from different registers also in different, and sometimes they're animals, sometimes they're plants. In thinking about this question, I made a little list of some of the ones that oh, here comes my cat, speaking of animals. We'll see if she appears.
Perfect timing.
There's one part where she says, I was Inés decorative plant, Inés house pet, Inés porcelain animal lost in the infinite recesses of the house and its silence. In another moment, Inés fawn would sniff her ears and knuckles. Later, I was Inés secret bird, Inés strategist, Inés invincible crow's beak. And so, within this sort of register, it's a kind of, I don't know if you could think about sort of the novel as this sort of this large kind of mass of something that's moving forward, and there's this kind of undercurrent of a kind of line of poetry rendering underneath, which is the different names of the selves and their evolutions kind of as creatures. And I think even in just that set of examples, the way that the identification with other things can either sort of show a sense of powerlessness, like house pets or decorative plant, and then strategist and secret bird, and these discoveries of power. So while translating them, what was really important to me was to protect that sort of the way that the book is always glancing around, and that to keep it very light on its feet in these animal references, and to incorporate the kind of the vein of them throughout the book. There was one, I think that, and I remember talking about this at one point with Gloria, and this I think was an interesting distinction between how Spanish and English manage animals and humans and pronouns and gender. Is the grandfather is always the beast, which in Spanish is la bestia. It's a feminine. It's the feminine pronoun for an animal. And so the decision, but he's the grandfather, and so the decision that I had to make was, if he is the beast, is he or it? When she's talking about the beast, is it an it beast or a he beast? And ultimately, we went for it, and I think that was also, it's a way that sort of, in many languages, we've normalized to talk about animals, is sort of, where is the cat? It's over there. And at the same time, the beast is such a formidable, really a truly terrifying presence in the book, with moments of tenderness that in a way make him or it more terrifying, sometimes the volatility of this character. But I think especially in sort of protecting the child's response, something about the emotional distance of the it felt important to sort of further animalize him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great point about the it and la. I hadn't thought about that. Okay, we are at the 45-minute mark, which is when I said I was going to start questions from the audience, but we have two more, and we're going to try to go through them kind of quickly, and then we'll take. Well, I know that we have one question from the audience, so we'll take those as soon as we get to these. So back to you, Gloria. Sorry, I got lost. Okay. You've talked about the intentional, about being intentional in your language as you're describing Inés, as a girl who fights against the world and the expectations of little girls, giving her freedom to be young, literally wild, in juxtaposition with her mother and her grandmother. And then we also see that in Maria. I want to hear about the process and also about Robin's process to depict these characterizations in English. And I think that's a little bit about what you were getting into right now.
Bueno, para mí otro de los temas que eran importantes para tratar en este libro era un poco como, va a sonar como muy grandilocuente, pero en verdad no lo es, y es como la historia de la mujer colombiana.
Claro.
One of the important subjects for me in writing this novel, which may sound grandiloquent but truly isn't, is the history of Colombian women.
Lo pensaba conmigo, ¿no? Como mi madre es la primera mujer de su familia en ir a la universidad, y mi madre me tuvo cuando yo tenía 28 años, o sea, solo pasaron 28 años y ella estaba en otro tipo de mundo, ¿no? En un mundo donde las mujeres no se podían divorciar en Colombia porque era escandaloso, donde las mujeres tenían que ir a la universidad, ya podían ir, pero también tenían que cuidar de su casa. Y mi generación es la primera generación de niños de padres divorciados que no era un escándalo.
I thought about in my own case. My mother, for instance, is the first woman in her family to have gotten a university degree. She had me when she was 28, and so at age 28, she was already in this other world. She was going to school, but she was also taking care of me. And this was an age when it was impossible. Women couldn't get divorced in Colombia, and they could go to college, but they also had all these other responsibilities, and you were punished if you left that system. And so my generation is the first generation of children of divorced parents in Colombia who have these other panoramas.
Y mi abuela, que también tuvo a mi madre muy joven, pues fue una mujer que no fue a la universidad, que tuvo 8 hijos, que se encargó de su casa, que todas sus responsabilidades eran domésticas y solo había pasado un muy corto periodo de tiempo. O sea, el año en que mi madre nació es el año en el que las mujeres en Colombia pudieron votar.
My grandmother, for another example, did not go to college, had my mother very young, had 8 children, and very little times. We're talking about, a really tiny span of time in which these changes took place. My grandmother was born the year that Colombian women were allowed to vote for the first time.
Entonces, eso a mí siempre me ha generado mucha fascinación, ¿no? Como estas 3 generaciones de mujeres hemos tenido diferentes vidas en un mismo lugar, ¿no? O sea, mi abuela solo podía encontrar la libertad casándose, mi madre la encontró estudiando y yo lo tengo todo, lo puedo hacer todo y yo he decidido no casarme, no tener hijos, estudiar más que lo que debería estudiar cualquiera.
This has always fascinated me, that in the case of my own family, these 3 generations, my grandmother could find freedom by getting married and having a family. My mother by going to the university. I have all of these things, all of these choices in which I choose not to get married, not to have children, to continue studying, to really do whatever I want.
Y también siento que se me intentaron imponer ciertas cosas culturales que, digamos, se reflejan en Inés, que es como, no te sientes de cierta manera, no lo hagas de esta manera, y a mí me interesaba mucho esa intersección entre clase y género, porque María es una niña de otra clase social que es muchísimo más libre que Inés, porque no tiene esas imposiciones burguesas de buenos modales.
I did have certain expectations imposed on me, like you need to sit in this particular way. And I was really interested in the intersection between gender and class in this sense. And so we have the case of Inés and her friendship with Maria, who comes from a completely different socioeconomic world, who in many senses, she is freer than than Inés, free at least of these sort of bourgeois rigidities.
Y es María quien le dice a Inés como que salga de la casa, que se vuelva salvaje, que se vuelva un animal, ¿no? Y siempre están con estos celos de María frente a todas las cosas que Inés tiene, como sus juguetes de niña rica, y todos esos otros sentimientos de Inés frente a ese mundo de afuera infinito que tiene María.
Maria is the one who encourages Inés to leave the house, to go outside, to explore this sort of animal world, to play in that way. And there's a tension running through the book in that Maria is always jealous of things that Inés has, the comforts, her sort of rich girl toys. And Inés, by turn, is jealous of Maria's access to this whole other world that she doesn't have access to.
Entonces, para mí era como muy importante mostrar eso, como mostrar todas estas mujeres, ¿no? Como esta niña que está atrapada en su clase social, esta madre que es muy joven y que en Colombia, y bueno, en Latinoamérica pasa mucho que cuando una mujer se vuelve madre, solo es madre, ya no es mujer, ya no es individuo, ¿no? Entonces, era una mujer muy joven y la quería mostrar con una vida sexual activa, como dejando su responsabilidad de madre al lado, y quería mostrar a esa abuela que ha tenido que aguantar como a ese patriarca, pero que en un momento también dice como, basta.
It was very important to me to show these different aspects of women's lives. And so there's the case of Maria and Inés, but there's also the case of Inés's mother, who's a very young woman. It happens often in Latin American cultures and elsewhere that women, once they become mothers, that's all they are, and they are ceased to be seen as women. And so it was important for me to show Inés's mother as a woman with an active sex life, with professional ambitions, and also to portray the grandmother as someone who's had to sort of put up with the oppression of this patriarch her entire life, and at a certain point also snaps and says enough.
Y ya.
Angelica,
Sí.
No. I was just going to say, yeah, go ahead. Maybe I'll sit this one out because that's a question mostly about the novel itself. Yeah.
Sounds good.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. I was just saying que los atrapamientos de las mujeres se ven entre las generaciones aquí, ¿verdad? También, como dices, Gloria. And just to repeat it in English, that you could see these entrapments that women, even through generations, are facing in the novel. And then just the last question before we jump into taking questions from the audience. Was it, to go off of what you were talking about cultural references in Colombia, was it hard to translate these cultural references in the English language? And did you find any issues translating these roles of women in Colombia to an English audience?
There were, I think the issue of references was one of the things that Gloria and I spoke most about along the way, because I think there were sort of three, not categories, but three sort of approaches that I took, that I ended up taking. This was not a plan, but it just sort of, this became sort of the process. That there were certain references like songs, and so we're talking, just very localized references of popular music, maybe Colombian musicians, but maybe from elsewhere in Latin America that were famous in the 80s and that would have been completely just household references, just stuff you would hear on the radio, that wouldn't necessarily translate at all, that wouldn't be automatic in that way. And some of them, I think when, my approach was often, if there was something that hinged on understanding that song or a different sort of reference, I would try either to just keep it intact and just trust the reader, not to hold the reader's hand and just trust them to, if they want to know more, they can look it up, they can sort of do some research. And in other cases to leave it intact, but to add a couple of phrases for context, to sort of flesh it out in such a way that the reader would deduce, okay, this is part of a cultural landscape. And in some cases where there was a kind of passing reference that maybe didn't need to be dwelled on, or there wasn't something else that ensued from it, I would try, and Gloria was so helpful, we talked a lot about these things, to find something that would have been a similarly familiar reference in the US in the 80s. And so I remember there was one part where Inés wakes up and she hears her mother singing a song. And I actually don't remember what the phrase was in Spanish, but it's sort of, I heard my mother singing a song about da da da. And so, Gloria, I think you suggested that we use, said, I think the English, I wrote it down here, I can't, oh yes, she was singing a song about wanting to know what love is, and so finding, a period song that would work, and but that had the same sort of emotional register. The song in Spanish is about us, it's an experience of yearning, and so to find a song of yearning that would have been popular in the 80s in the US. And there were other cases like that, I think even the example we read at the beginning, which is less about references, but certainly about expressions and colloquialisms that in the passage of the book that Inés's dad gives to her and teaching her to read. There's a very common phrase in elementary school books is mi mamá me mima, and so you've got that literally it means my mother spoils me, but it's the alliteration is important. It's part of the exercise, and there just isn't, it didn't work exactly the same way. So we went for just a completely different reference, the cat's on the mat, or the cook, which is, I think, that's a great phrase to learn vowels. So those sorts of equivalencies. And as for gender relations, or how to sort of translate, if it was difficult to translate the roles of women into English, no. I think each text is culturally different in some ways. I think that is extremely tragically relatable in the States and in other cultures, of sort of having these generational divides and the sort of form of patriarchal oppression. What was a bit harder, I think, and this is just something that's built into the book itself and into the nature of the translation, is I think some of the class registers, in the sense that in Latin America, I live in Mexico, this is true in Mexico as well, that even people who are affluent but not necessarily wealthy will have domestic help, will have people who come to clean their house, will have a nanny who lives with them even. And I think I think that was something just contextually, which is perhaps a bit different, but again, something that is clearly presented in the novel as part of the social reality that is part, I think, that's part of translation too, is being confronted with something that isn't immediately translatable to your circumstances and trying to understand, trying to learn about how it's working there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I feel like I've taken up all the time with the questions. So, Gloria, ¿querías decir algo sobre eso? Okay. There's one question from the audience, and I'll ask it here. How much was the process of translating the book a dialogue between both? Were there instances in which you both needed to discuss how to phrase in English, which I think you touched on a little bit?
I'm going to say this in English because I don't want Robin to embarrass herself again. But I am a very shy person, and I was like starstruck. So I was like, I can't write to her. Like, I don't know how to talk to her. I was really starstruck. Pero luego ya, en las conversaciones creo que sí, lo más difícil era esas referencias, sobre todo porque lo que yo juego a no decir que es Bogotá, sino a eludir que es Bogotá, y eso lo hago con las referencias pop, ¿no? Como no digo esa canción de ese señor, sino que pongo la letra de la canción.
Mm-hmm. Claro.
Yes, that was definitely the references were the trickiest part, because part of what I tried to do in the novel was not explicitly say that it was Bogota, but to evoke Bogota and its identity through the use of those sorts of songs, for instance. Not saying, this song is by this guy in this year, but to allow that to be an illusion. So yes, we spoke, I'm sorry, changing from just responding to Gloria, their translator hat off, that we spoke a lot about those things. And I would just like to add that Gloria was just so responsive and wonderful, and there were lots of cases also of register, of slang, of kind of more of a childish register, where in reading the translation, once I had a drafter and me asking her questions, that she had wonderful ideas, and it was very much, I would say, in register, and there were lots of things that we spoke about too. Pero creo que te interrumpí, perdón.
No, no, no.
Otra cosa.
Otra cosa que pasó es que, digamos, en Latinoamérica pasa mucho y es que cada región tiene su acento, su dialecto, y en Colombia, cuando yo le pasaba mi manuscrito a amigos de otra región de Colombia, veían algo y decían, no, esta palabra no la entiendo, o uff, qué cosa tan bogotana, ¿cómo lo dices? ¿No? Y Robin me hacía muchas preguntas también como de esas, como cosas tan específicas que para mí ni siquiera eran slang, sino que eran palabras normales, y eso también me hizo como ver ese lenguaje y esa identidad de Bogotá de otra manera.
Throughout Latin America, and certainly in Colombia, there are regional uses of certain words, slang, registers, and so that even in showing the book in Spanish to friends of mine from other parts of Colombia, there were times when they would say, what is that? Or that sounds so strange. Or there were ways that words that I would use that I didn't even think about because they're part of my register as someone from Bogota. And so there were things that Robin would ask about, sort of what is this word, and that had to do not so much with sort of translation English to Spanish, but translation of a Bogota term.
Yeah.
Gracias. Pues esa es la única pregunta. If anybody else wants to ask any questions, let us know. Post them in the chat, but we can talk about anything else now while we're we're waiting. Déjame ver, aquí te tenía otra pregunta mientras estaban platicando. Mientras esperamos, cuando estabas hablando de una referencia de Shining, nunca se me hubiera ocurrido, pero es tan perfecto cuando lo piensas. And so I'm just saying that the reference to The Shining, I would have never thought of it, but it was such a perfect reference once you think about it. And there is senses of horror, como que sí hay algo que se siente como horror, ¿verdad? So yeah, it's this unknown world of violence in Inés's life.
And also it becomes, the house itself becomes a sort of character in a way, or a force, you know, and it's both the landscape that Inés explores by herself, and also that she gets to sort of behave differently in when Maria is around, and they break into rooms where they're forbidden to go, and they get lost, and just this sense of truly a landscape, like an entire world. And you know, Angie, you mentioned in this sort of the multiple kinds of ends of the worlds, that it's significantly, the book sort of all leads up to Inés's birthday party, and which is held in the hall, you know, like the front hall, this
Right.
fancy space, and so the way that all of these tensions come to a head, in the house, I think, sort of hotel wise, is like in The Shining too.
That was the house where I grew up, and it then became a pole dance studio.
Wow.
And when the book went out, they finally got to sell the house, because it was my grandfather's house. So he died and they could sell it. And they demolished it, and now it's a parking lot, and it's very sad for me.
Oh.
Wow.
Talk about transformations.
I know that is a world ending.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, another question has come through. How much can you change from the original version of a translation without disrespecting the author, the essence of the story, and also keeping the integrity of the story?
It's a great question and a big one. And I think I'm not just trying to get out of answering it, but I do think that there's, it's hard to come up with a single answer. I think, you know, there's also a huge advantage that I've had in working with both an author who is living and who is as nice as Gloria is, and so we can talk about these things. And I think, you know, I do try always. I mean, I don't believe in putting things in that aren't there just because you feel like it. Like that's never okay with me. I do think there are cases, like I think about the example we talked about a little bit ago, you know, where the examples in the reading books, for instance, are completely different. And I think there's actually a part of it which is a little bit longer to sort of flesh out the example that ended up in English. So you could argue that that's a departure. You know, that's definitely a departure from the original text, and yet it's done in order to serve the essence, to honor the essence of an original passage that otherwise would have been not just confusing but distracting. You know, it's a reference. It's not an entire plot line. It's not a conclusion. It's a sort of part of the atmosphere that Gloria talks about. And so I think there are times when you want the reader to stop and pay attention to a particular thing and unpack it, and there are times when you want them to be able to keep going without being confused. So I think that those are calls that translators have to make and get to make. I think doing something against the spirit of the book would be to remove things out of personal preference, to add things out of personal whim. I think those are very different. Those are very different decisions. But again, I think, you know, I haven't translated a lot either of kind of sort of, you know, of sort of classics, which I think have this sort of intense weight. You know, this sort of, if something's been around for a long time and already has this aura sort of unalterability about it. Or even just if an author, if you can't be in touch with the author, if they don't want to be in touch, if they're not around anymore, I would be very anxious about making those decisions. I would have to make them anyway, but it feels great to be able to ask the author and to have Gloria's input and vision involved, and it becomes a collaborative work. Absolutely, that's the joy of it too, is that collaboration.
Gloria, ¿querías decir?
No.
Well, I think part of seeing some of that in the background, you know, I for the most part, the translation was already complete when I stepped in, but it was so great to see the collaboration between both of you. I think when we were talking about the title, we were going back and forth. I'm like, does it have too many prepositions? Well, the Spanish one has too many prepositions. Like, and it's like, no, this is just such a perfect way to translate it. There's no other way. So it's just kind of where the translation and where the story takes you. So yeah. Okay, I think that's the only other question. Well, we could either end it there or wait for others, but in the meantime, I would just want to say thank you everybody who did tune in. We're so glad that everybody was flexible, that you bared with us on the change of date. We really wanted to have this chat. Es la primera vez que estoy conociendo a Gloria, por primera vez, aunque sea nomás por Zoom, pero it's been wonderful to talk about this beautiful, beautiful novel in translation and what it has become in the English language as well. If you haven't already seen in the chat, we linked the book. There's a discount code for it as well. I'm going to hold it up one more time so that everybody can see it. Please, if you can, go get your hands on this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful novel. And someone my colleague just put the link there again. So thank you, everyone. Gracias, Robin, Gloria. Es todo un placer hablar con ustedes sobre esta novela que me encanta tanto. It's so great to speak to you. If anybody has any last chat, as well as you guys, you, Robin and Gloria.
No, just
thank you. I am like I don't think my wildest dreams could imagine Inés speaking English. Like, like Inés didn't even go to school. She was 6 years old. She didn't go to school. She was just learning how to read. So, well, this is like Like I couldn't imagine me working like in my little room in Bogota. Now talking about this is like crazy, really. So thank you so much for making this crazy thing happen.
Thank you for bringing Inés to us.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been such a joy to work with both of you and with Inés.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Mhm.
lovely, lovely to talk to you today.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.